July 18th, 1940. Kaunas, Lithuania. The line outside the Japanese consulate stretched around the block, growing longer each hour as desperate families clutched whatever documents they possessed. Inside the second-floor office, Chiune Sugihara stood at his window, watching the crowds swell, each face a story of terror fleeing the Nazi advance. The telegram from Tokyo lay on his desk, its message unambiguous. Do not issue transit visas. The Japanese Foreign Ministry had spoken. But as Sugihara watched mothers holding children, elderly men who had walked for weeks, young couples whose entire worlds had collapsed, he understood that some orders demanded to be disobeyed. The mathematics of survival were brutally simple. Behind these refugees lay German-occupied Poland, where the SS had begun implementing racial policies that would become the Holocaust. Ahead lay the Soviet Union, nominally neutral but increasingly hostile to Polish refugees. The only escape route ran east through the Soviet Union to Vladivostok, then by ship to Japan, and finally to whatever destination would accept them. But this route required two impossible documents: Soviet transit visas, which few could obtain, and Japanese transit visas, which Tokyo had forbidden Sugihara to provide. In the next 29 days, working 18 hours daily until his hand cramped around his pen, Sugihara would write approximately 6,000 visas, transforming his consulate into a factory of salvation. He would ignore 3 direct orders from his superiors. He would continue issuing visas even after Japan closed his consulate. He would hand visas through train windows as Japanese officials physically removed him from Lithuania. And he would save more Jewish lives than any other single person except Oskar Schindler, accomplishing this miracle with nothing more than pen, paper, and the moral courage to recognize that bureaucracy could be weaponized for good as easily as for evil. Chiune Sugihara was an unlikely candidate for heroism. Born January 1st, 1900 in Yaotsu, a small town in Gifu Prefecture, he came from a middle-class family with no particular distinction. His father, a tax official, had traditional expectations for his eldest son: medical school, a respectable practice, marriage to an appropriate woman from their social circle. But Sugihara possessed a gift for languages and an independent streak that would define his life. When his father secured his admission to Waseda University's medical program, Sugihara deliberately failed the entrance examinations to avoid the career path chosen for him. Instead, he enrolled in Waseda's English literature program, financing his education through tutoring while expanding his linguistic abilities to include Russian, French, and German. The Japanese Foreign Ministry noticed this polyglot talent in 1919, recruiting Sugihara for their prestigious diplomatic corps. His first posting came in 1924 to Harbin, Manchuria, then a cosmopolitan city where Russian émigrés fleeing the Bolshevik Revolution mixed with Chinese merchants, Japanese administrators, and European businessmen. Harbin proved transformative for the young diplomat. The city's significant Jewish population, primarily Russian Jews who had fled westward pogroms for Siberia's relative tolerance, introduced Sugihara to Jewish culture and the precariousness of Jewish existence. He attended synagogue services, learned basic Yiddish phrases, and developed friendships that would inform his actions 15 years later. During his decade in Manchuria, Sugihara distinguished himself as a capable intelligence officer. He spoke fluent Russian and maintained networks throughout the Soviet Far East, providing valuable information about Stalin's military capabilities and political intentions. In 1932, he participated in negotiations regarding the purchase of the Chinese Eastern Railway from the Soviet Union, earning recognition for his diplomatic skill. But in 1935, Sugihara made a decision that foreshadowed his later defiance of authority. The Japanese military, increasingly dominant in Manchurian governance, demanded that Sugihara sign documents approving the brutal treatment of Chinese civilians. He refused. This principled stand ended his Manchurian career. The Foreign Ministry, embarrassed by an official who placed morality above obedience, transferred him to relatively minor postings, first in Helsinki, then in the Lithuanian capital of Kaunas. Kaunas, in 1939, was a city living on borrowed time. Lithuania had regained independence after World War I, establishing a parliamentary democracy that lasted barely 2 decades before authoritarianism replaced it. The capital had moved from Vilnius to Kaunas after Poland seized Vilnius in 1920, creating a temporary capital that nonetheless developed robust cultural and economic life. The city's Jewish community, approximately 30,000 people, constituted 1/4 of Kaunas's population. These Lithuanian Jews, known as Litvaks, had created one of Europe's most vibrant Jewish intellectual centers, with excellent schools, thriving businesses, and rich cultural institutions. Sugihara arrived in Kaunas on November 28, 1939, as vice consul, effectively heading the consulate since no ambassador had been appointed. His official role was facilitating trade relations and monitoring Soviet activities. His actual mission, which he understood though it was never explicitly stated, was intelligence gathering about German and Soviet intentions in Eastern Europe. From his office windows, he observed the chess game of empires preparing to devour small nations. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939 had divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence, with Lithuania initially assigned to Germany before a secret protocol traded it to Soviet control. Every diplomat in Kaunas understood that Lithuanian independence was measured in months, not years. September 1st, 1939, brought the German invasion of Poland that triggered World War II. Within weeks, the German blitzkrieg had overrun Polish defenses, and on September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, completing Poland's partition. Between these crushing jaws, Polish civilians fled in all directions seeking any possible sanctuary. Thousands moved northeast into Lithuania, the last remaining neutral nation between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. Among these refugees came Poland's Jewish population, facing not just military occupation, but the beginning of systematic persecution that would escalate into industrialized genocide. The refugee crisis overwhelmed Kaunas. By October 1939, approximately 15,000 Polish Jews had entered Lithuania, joining the existing Jewish population. Initially, Lithuania accepted these refugees, recognizing both humanitarian obligation and political reality. But as German pressure increased and Soviet intentions grew clearer, Lithuanian authorities became increasingly reluctant hosts. Refugees found themselves trapped in a shrinking safe zone with no clear path forward. European nations and the United States maintained strict immigration quotas that effectively barred Jewish refugees. The doors were closing worldwide. Then came an unexpected possibility. The Dutch consul in Kaunas, Jan Zwartendijk, discovered that the Dutch colonial territory of Curaçao in the Caribbean required no entry visa for temporary stays. Working with a small group of refugee advocates, Zwartendijk began issuing declarations stating that Curaçao accepted visitors without visas. These declarations, while technically accurate, were practically useless since reaching Curaçao from Lithuania was geographically impossible without transit through multiple countries, each requiring its own visa. But combined with Soviet transit visas and Japanese transit visas, Curaçao declarations created a theoretical escape route. Refugees could travel by rail across the Soviet Union to Vladivostok, then by ship to Japan, and theoretically onward to Curaçao, though reaching the Caribbean island from Japan was itself nearly impossible. The Soviet Union, eager to rid itself of Polish refugees, began issuing transit visas to those who could demonstrate onward destinations. The Dutch Curaçao declarations satisfied this requirement. Suddenly, the only missing link in the escape chain was Japanese transit visas, which Sugihara's consulate could legally provide. But Tokyo had other intentions. The Japanese Foreign Ministry, bound by its alliance with Nazi Germany through the Anti-Comintern Pact, had explicitly instructed all diplomatic posts to reject visa applications from refugees lacking adequate funds and confirmed final destinations. The policy's purpose was transparent, preventing Jewish refugees from using Japan as an escape route from German persecution. On July 11, 1940, a delegation of 5 Jewish community leaders approached the Japanese consulate seeking an urgent meeting with Sugihara. They were led by Zorak Warhaftig, a lawyer and Zionist activist who had organized refugee assistance in Vilnius before fleeing to Kaunas. Warhaftig explained the situation's desperate mathematics. Thousands of Jewish refugees faced 3 options: remain in Lithuania and face Soviet annexation, followed by likely deportation to Siberia, attempt to return to German-occupied Poland and face Nazi persecution, or find some escape route eastward. The Japanese transit visa was the final link needed to make escape possible. Sugihara listened carefully, asking detailed questions about the refugees' circumstances, their destinations, their resources. He understood immediately what Tokyo's policy meant, condemning these people to Nazi hands. But he also understood the risk of defying direct orders. Japanese diplomatic culture emphasized absolute obedience to hierarchy. A consul who ignored foreign ministry directives faced career destruction at minimum, potential prosecution for insubordination. His wife Yukiko and their 3 young sons depended on his diplomatic salary. Defiance could mean poverty, disgrace, possibly imprisonment. That evening, Sugihara discussed the situation with Yukiko. She was 5 months pregnant with their 4th child, facing an uncertain future if her husband's career collapsed. But Yukiko, who had witnessed the refugees' desperation firsthand when they came to the consulate door, supported whatever decision her husband made. She later recalled telling him that they could not ignore people suffering for the sake of career security. If he believed issuing visas was morally necessary, she would support him regardless of consequences. This conversation, though brief, proved crucial. Knowing his family would stand behind him gave Sugihara the courage to make the decision that would define his life. On July 18th, Sugihara sent a cable to the Foreign Ministry in Tokyo requesting authorization to issue transit visas to Jewish refugees possessing Curaçao declarations and Soviet transit visas. He carefully framed his request in bureaucratic language, emphasizing that these refugees were merely transiting through Japan and posed no burden to Japanese resources. Tokyo's response arrived 3 days later. Rejected. The refugees must possess adequate funds and confirmed destinations. The Curaçao declarations, the Foreign Ministry noted, were insufficient since Curaçao was a Dutch colony, and the Netherlands was now German-occupied, making these declarations potentially invalid. Sugihara sent a second cable on July 22nd, explaining that the refugees faced life-threatening situations and that humanitarian considerations should override technical requirements. Tokyo's second response came July 24th. Rejected. Policy unchanged. Refugees lacking proper documentation must be denied visas. Sugihara understood the message. The Foreign Ministry was not interested in humanitarian considerations. It was prioritizing its alliance with Nazi Germany over the lives of refugees fleeing German persecution. On July 27th, Sugihara sent his third and final cable, making one last attempt to obtain authorization. This time he emphasized the refugees' desperate circumstances explicitly, noting that denying visas would effectively sentence them to death or deportation. Tokyo's response arrived July 28th, rejected, third time. The Foreign Ministry added a stern warning that consular officials must comply with established policies without deviation. The message was clear. Issuing visas to these refugees would constitute insubordination. Sugihara spent the night of July 28th sleepless, wrestling with the decision before him. His diplomatic training emphasized obedience, hierarchy, following orders without question. But his conscience told him that some orders were fundamentally immoral, that bureaucratic obedience could never justify abandoning people to certain death. In his later testimony, Sugihara described his reasoning. He was a government official, but he was also a human being. If he followed orders and denied visas, these people would die, and his hands would be clean by bureaucratic standards, but stained with moral failure. If he defied orders and issued visas, he would lose his career but save thousands of lives. The choice, though difficult, was ultimately clear. On July 29, 1940, Chiune Sugihara opened his consulate doors and began issuing transit visas. The line outside stretched for blocks as word spread through the refugee community that the Japanese consul was willing to help. Sugihara established a simple system. Refugees who possessed Soviet transit visas and Curaçao declarations would receive Japanese transit visas valid for travel through Japan to onward destinations. He asked no questions about the refugees' ultimate plans. He did not investigate whether they actually intended to reach Curaçao, which most certainly did not. He understood that these transit visas were lifelines, paths to safety, and what happened after refugees left Japan was a problem for another day. The bureaucratic requirements for each visa were substantial. Official Japanese transit visas required specific information: applicant's name, date of birth, nationality, occupation, intended route through Japan, confirmed onward transportation, adequate financial resources. Each visa needed to be written by hand in Japanese on official consular stationery, signed and stamped by the consul, with information recorded in consular registers. The process was designed to take 30 to 40 minutes per visa. At that rate, Sugihara could process perhaps 12 visas daily. But with thousands of refugees needing documentation and time running out before Soviet annexation of Lithuania, 12 visas daily was wholly inadequate. Sugihara revolutionized the visa process. He simplified the required information, using standardized phrases where possible. He trained his assistants to prepare visa forms while he focused exclusively on signing and stamping. He developed abbreviations and shortcuts that maintained legal validity while reducing processing time. Most dramatically, he abandoned the Foreign Ministry's requirement for individual visas, instead issuing family visas that covered entire households with a single document. A family visa that might cover 8 people required only marginally more time than an individual visa, but saved countless hours overall. The workload was crushing. Sugihara began each morning at 7 o'clock when the first refugees arrived at the consulate door. He worked continuously through the day, breaking only for brief meals that Yukiko brought to his desk. He continued late into evening, often past midnight, until exhaustion forced him to stop. His right hand, constantly gripping the pen, developed severe cramping. Yukiko massaged his hand each night to restore circulation and reduce pain. Some evenings, Sugihara's hand hurt so badly he could not hold chopsticks at dinner. But the next morning, he returned to his desk and continued signing visas. The refugees who received visas remembered Sugihara's dedication with awe and gratitude. Sali Ganor, who was 11 years old when his family received their visa, recalled watching Sugihara work through the consulate window. The Japanese consul never looked up, never stopped moving his pen, never showed frustration, though the line at its side never seemed to shrink. Another refugee, Hermann Schaufeld, described Sugihara as appearing almost mechanical in his focus, as though he had transformed himself into a visa-writing machine to maximize the number of people he could save. Not all refugees who sought visas received them. Sugihara maintained the requirement that applicants possessed Soviet transit visas, since Japanese visas were useless without the ability to cross Soviet territory. This requirement excluded many refugees who lacked the resources or connections to obtain Soviet documentation. Some refugees reported that Sugihara wept when forced to turn them away, knowing that Soviet paperwork requirements were condemning people to likely death, but maintaining this requirement was necessary. If Sugihara issued Japanese visas to refugees who could not legally cross the Soviet Union, those visas would be useless, and Tokyo might use the irregularity as grounds to invalidate all visas and recall him immediately. The Soviet annexation of Lithuania proceeded rapidly through July and August 1940. On July 21st, Lithuania's puppet government formally requested admission to the Soviet Union. On August 3rd, the Supreme Soviet approved Lithuanian admission as the 14th Soviet Republic. Soviet troops already stationed in Lithuania since October 1939 now became occupation forces. Soviet officials began implementing administrative control, including closing foreign consulates. The Japanese consulate received orders to cease operations and relocate to Berlin by September 1st. As the deadline approached, Sugihara intensified his efforts. He understood that once the consulate closed, his ability to help refugees would end. He extended working hours further, beginning earlier each morning and continuing later each night. On several occasions, he worked straight through the night, sustained by tea and sheer determination. Yukiko, heavily pregnant, helped where she could, preparing visa forms, maintaining records, managing the constant flow of refugees through their home. August 31st arrived. The consulate's final official day of operation. Soviet authorities informed Sugihara he must vacate the building immediately. But the line outside still contained hundreds of refugees, desperate for visas. Sugihara moved operations to his hotel, the Metropolis, and continued issuing visas from his hotel room. For 2 more weeks, as he prepared to leave Lithuania, he maintained his visa production. Refugees came to his hotel door. He signed visas in the hotel lobby. He wrote visas during meals in the hotel restaurant. Finally, on September 5th, Sugihara boarded the train that would take him and his family from Kaunas to Berlin. As the train prepared to depart, refugees crowded the platform, still pleading for visas. Through the train window, Sugihara continued signing visa forms and passing them to refugees outside. Witnesses reported that he was still signing visas as the train pulled away from the station. According to some accounts, Sugihara threw his consul seal to refugees on the platform, telling them to forge whatever visas they needed to survive. This detail remains unconfirmed, but the image captures Sugihara's commitment, helping refugees until the absolute last possible moment. The journey of the Sugihara visa holders began almost immediately. The first refugees to receive visas departed Lithuania in early August, traveling by train across the Soviet Union on the Trans-Siberian Railway. This journey covered approximately 5,000 miles from Lithuania to Vladivostok, requiring 10 to 14 days under ideal conditions. The Soviet transit visas Sugihara required provided legal authority for this crossing, though the journey itself was fraught with danger. Soviet officials were unpredictable, sometimes honoring transit visas and sometimes demanding bribes or additional documentation. Refugees traveled with whatever possessions they could carry, knowing they might lose everything to Soviet inspection or theft. Vladivostok, the Soviet Pacific port where the Trans-Siberian Railway ended, became the refugees' gateway to freedom. From Vladivostok, steamship lines operated regular service to Tsuruga, Japan, a journey of approximately 2 days across the Sea of Japan. The Japanese shipping companies, bound by international maritime law, could not refuse passengers holding valid Japanese visas. Throughout autumn 1940 and into early 1941, hundreds of refugees arrived weekly in Vladivostok, presenting their Sugihara visas and boarding ships to Japan. The arrival in Tsuruga brought refugees face-to-face with Japanese immigration officials who had received no instructions about this unexpected influx of visa holders. The officials were confronted with thousands of refugees presenting transit visas issued by a consul who had been explicitly ordered not to issue them. Technically, these visas violated foreign ministry policy, but they were unquestionably authentic, properly signed and stamped by an authorized consular official. Japanese bureaucratic culture, while emphasizing obedience, also emphasized proper documentation. The visas were legal, regardless of the circumstances of their issuance. Japanese immigration authorities made the pragmatic decision to honor Sugihara's visas. Refugees were admitted to Japan and directed to Kobe, a port city with a small Jewish community that could provide assistance. The logic was simple. These people possessed legal visas. They were transiting through Japan with stated onward destinations, and they posed no security threat. Denying entry would create an international incident, potentially embarrassing Japan before the world. Better to admit them and move them along to their next destination. Kobe's Jewish community, though small, mobilized to assist the refugee influx. The Jewish community of Japan, led by Russian Jews who had settled in Japan after fleeing Bolshevik Russia, established reception centers, temporary housing, and employment assistance. They coordinated with international Jewish organizations to secure funding and facilitate onward emigration. The Japanese government, while not enthusiastic about hosting Jewish refugees, tolerated their presence in Kobe as long as they continued efforts to depart for permanent destinations. The practical challenge facing refugees in Kobe was finding countries willing to accept them permanently. The Curaçao declarations that had justified their Soviet and Japanese transit visas were never intended as genuine destinations. Curaçao, a small Caribbean island, could not absorb thousands of refugees, and reaching Curaçao from Japan was practically impossible given wartime shipping disruptions. Instead, refugees in Kobe sought visas to any country that would accept them: the United States, Canada, Australia, various Latin American nations, Palestine under British mandate, anywhere offering permanent refuge. The process was agonizingly slow. American immigration quotas, established by the Restrictive Immigration Act of 1924, limited Eastern European Jewish immigration to a trickle. British restrictions on Jewish immigration to Palestine, imposed through the White Paper of 1939, effectively closed that destination. Most other nations maintained similar barriers, reluctant to accept Jewish refugees in large numbers. Refugees in Kobe spent months navigating bureaucracies, writing letters to distant relatives, appealing to relief organizations, searching desperately for any nation willing to grant permanent residence. Despite these obstacles, most Sugihara visa holders eventually found permanent refuge. International Jewish organizations, particularly the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, provided critical funding and advocacy. Many refugees secured visas to Shanghai, China, which uniquely required no visa for entry and had become a refuge for approximately 20,000 Jewish refugees fleeing Europe. Others obtained transit visas to various Pacific and Latin American destinations. Some managed the nearly impossible feat of securing American immigration visas. By late 1941, approximately 5,000 of the 6,000 Sugihara visa holders had departed Japan for permanent destinations. Then came December 7, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and entered World War II on the side of Nazi Germany. The roughly 1,000 Jewish refugees still remaining in Kobe faced a terrifying reality. They were now trapped in an Axis nation allied with the regime they had fled. Japanese authorities could have deported them, imprisoned them, or worse, handed them to German custody. Instead, the Japanese government made a remarkable decision. These refugees held valid transit visas issued by a Japanese official. They had committed no crimes. They would be treated as legitimate visitors despite Japan's alliance with Nazi Germany. The refugees remaining in Japan were relocated to Shanghai, which Japan controlled after occupying the city in 1937. In Shanghai's Hongqiu district, Japanese authorities established a designated area for Jewish refugees, euphemistically called the Shanghai Ghetto, though it lacked the walls and guards of European ghettos. Conditions were difficult, overcrowding was severe, disease was common, food was scarce. But it was not Auschwitz. It was not Treblinka. The refugees survived, kept alive by their Sugihara visas and Japanese reluctance to participate directly in the Holocaust, despite alliance with Nazi Germany. The Japanese refusal to persecute Jews within their sphere of control has puzzled historians. Japan had signed the Anti-Comintern Pact with Nazi Germany. Japanese officials received German requests to implement anti-Jewish measures in territories under Japanese control. The Gestapo operated in Shanghai and pressured Japanese authorities to take action against Jewish refugees. Yet Japan consistently declined, maintaining that Jews under Japanese jurisdiction would be treated according to Japanese law, not German racial policies. Various explanations have been proposed for this stance. Some historians suggest Japanese racial ideology, while considering Japanese racially superior, did not share Nazi obsession with Jewish persecution. Others point to pragmatic considerations. Jews in Shanghai and elsewhere posed no threat to Japanese security and offered potential economic benefits. Still others credit individuals within the Japanese government who, like Sugihara, recognized fundamental human decency should transcend political alliance. The most comprehensive explanation may combine all these factors with one additional element: the Japanese concept of honor regarding valid documentation. Sugihara's visas were legally issued by an authorized official. Japanese culture placed tremendous weight on proper documentation and contractual obligations. To revoke these visas or harm their holders would violate the implicit contract created when Japan's official seal was affixed to the documents. This interpretation suggests that Sugihara's decision to issue visas created not just legal authorization, but moral obligation that constrained Japanese actions even after Japan entered the war. Meanwhile, Chiune Sugihara's diplomatic career followed its predicted trajectory. His assignment to Berlin beginning September 1940 placed him in Nazi Germany's capital, just as Sugihara was violating policy to save Jews from Nazi persecution. The Foreign Ministry surely knew about the visa issuance. Refugees were arriving in Japan by the thousands, all holding Sugihara's signature. Yet no disciplinary action was immediately taken. Sugihara continued serving in Berlin, then in Prague, then in Königsberg, moving through various Eastern European postings as the war progressed. In April 1945, as Soviet forces advanced toward Königsberg, Sugihara and his family became trapped in the city. The siege of Königsberg was brutal. with Soviet troops taking revenge for German invasion of Russia. Sugihara spent 18 months in Soviet prison camps, enduring harsh conditions that damaged his health permanently. His wife Yukiko and their children survived in refugee camps, uncertain whether Sugihara lived. The family reunited in 1947 when Soviet authorities finally released Sugihara, who had lost significant weight and suffered from malnutrition and exposure. Returning to Japan in 1947, Sugihara reported to the Foreign Ministry expecting new assignment. Instead, he was informed that his services were no longer required. The official explanation was bureaucratic restructuring following Japan's defeat. The actual reason, though never explicitly stated, was clearly his defiance of orders in Lithuania. Japanese diplomatic culture did not forget or forgive such insubordination, even 7 years later. At age 47, with no job, 4 children to support, and health compromised by Soviet imprisonment, Sugihara faced bleak prospects. He worked various jobs over the following decades, never discussing his actions in Lithuania. He found employment with a trading company in Moscow for 16 years, then returned to Japan to work part-time positions. His family lived modestly, never prospering financially. Sugihara maintained silence about the visas, partly from Japanese cultural reticence about self-promotion, and partly from genuine uncertainty about whether his actions had made any difference. He had lost contact with the refugees after leaving Lithuania. For all he knew, Soviet authorities had prevented their travel, or Japanese immigration officials had rejected the visas, or some other bureaucratic obstacle had rendered his efforts meaningless. Then, in 1968, 28 years after issuing the visas, Sugihara received an unexpected visitor. A Jewish man appeared at his door in Tokyo, asking if he was the Chiune Sugihara who had served as consul in Kaunas in 1940. When Sugihara confirmed his identity, the visitor wept with gratitude. He was one of the visa recipients, now living in Israel, and he had spent years searching for the Japanese diplomat who had saved his life. He wanted Sugihara to know that the visas had worked, that thousands of people had survived because of his courage, that entire families existed because he had defied orders. This visitor was Joshua Nishri, who had fled Poland to Lithuania as a teenager. Nishri had received his family's visa from Sugihara in August 1940, traveled across the Soviet Union, reached Japan, eventually settled in Palestine, fought in Israel's War of Independence, and built a life his parents had never imagined possible. After the war, Nishri had tried to locate Sugihara, searching through foreign ministry records and contacting the Japanese embassy in Israel. For years, his searches found nothing. Japanese authorities claimed no record of a consul named Sugihara serving in Lithuania. Finally, through persistence and luck, Nishri located Sugihara living quietly in suburban Tokyo. Nishri's visit initiated the process of recognition that would eventually bring Sugihara international honor. Nishri contacted Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Memorial Authority, providing testimony about Sugihara's actions. Other visa recipients came forward with their stories. Yad Vashem investigators verified the accounts, examined surviving visas, confirmed the timeline. The evidence was overwhelming. This minor Japanese diplomat, acting alone against his government's explicit orders, had saved more Jewish lives than any single person except Oskar Schindler. On January 18, 1985, 45 years after issuing his first visa, Chiune Sugihara traveled to Jerusalem to receive recognition as righteous among the nations, the highest honor Israel grants to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. Sugihara was 85 years old, his health declining, but he made the journey accompanied by his wife Yukiko and their surviving children. The ceremony at Yad Vashem attracted hundreds of visa recipients and their descendants, people whose existence testified to his courage. In his brief acceptance speech, Sugihara spoke with characteristic modesty. He said he had merely done what any decent person would do when confronted with suffering. He had not considered his actions heroic at the time, simply necessary. He was a government official, yes, but he was also a human being, and when government policy conflicted with humanity, he had chosen humanity. He wished he could have done more, issued more visas, saved more people. He thought often about those he had been forced to turn away. The recognition came too late for Sugihara to enjoy it long. He died July 31st, 1986, just 18 months after the Jerusalem ceremony. But the final years of his life brought him satisfaction he had not known for decades. The letters from visa recipients and their children arrived daily, each one telling him that his actions had mattered, that families existed because of his courage, that good had triumphed over evil in at least one small corner of the Holocaust's darkness. The legacy of Sugihara's visas extended far beyond the 6,000 people he directly saved. Those 6,000 people had children and grandchildren. Conservative estimates suggest that approximately 40,000 people alive today descend from Sugihara visa recipients. These descendants include scientists, artists, business people, teachers, parents raising another generation. They represent a vibrant community that would not exist without one man's decision to disobey orders. Among the notable descendants of Sugihara visa recipients are Olympic athletes, accomplished musicians, successful entrepreneurs, and ordinary people living meaningful lives. Each one represents the immeasurable value of human life, the importance of individual moral courage, and the power of one person to change history. The refugees Sugihara saved were not statistics. They were individuals with names, faces, stories, potential. They were Joshua Nishri building a new nation in Israel. They were Sali Ganor writing memoirs of survival. They were thousands of others pursuing their dreams because a Japanese diplomat believed their lives mattered more than his career. The story raises profound questions about moral responsibility, bureaucratic obedience, and individual conscience. Sugihara faced a choice that millions of people throughout history have faced in various forms: obey orders or follow conscience. Most people choose obedience. The costs of defiance are immediate and certain, while the costs of obedience are diffuse and deniable. Sugihara could have told himself he was just following orders, that policy decisions belonged to his superiors, that individual officials cannot be held responsible for systemic evil. Many people in similar situations chose exactly this path of rationalization. What made Sugihara different was his refusal to hide behind bureaucratic systems. He recognized that obedience to immoral orders made him complicit in immorality. He understood that preserving his career by condemning refugees to death would destroy him more completely than any professional punishment. He chose to act according to conscience, knowing that the price would be high, but the alternative would be living with knowledge that he had betrayed fundamental humanity. The contrast with Adolf Eichmann, another bureaucrat whose decisions affected Jewish lives, could not be starker. Eichmann famously claimed at his trial that he was merely following orders, implementing policies determined by his superiors, functioning as an efficient administrator rather than a moral agent. Sugihara faced the same choice and reached the opposite conclusion. He recognized that bureaucratic roles do not exempt individuals from moral responsibility, that following orders is itself a choice, that efficiency in implementing evil policies is evil efficiency. Sugihara's story also illuminates the complex relationship between Japan and Nazi Germany during World War II. The two nations were allied through the Anti-Comintern Pact and later the Tripartite Pact. They coordinated military strategy and shared intelligence. yet their alliance was always somewhat artificial, based more on shared opposition to the Soviet Union and Western powers than on genuine ideological affinity. Japan never embraced Nazi racial ideology regarding Jews, never implemented anti-Jewish measures in territories under Japanese control, and repeatedly declined German requests for cooperation in the Holocaust. This Japanese refusal to participate in the Holocaust remains one of World War II's more remarkable facts. German officials stationed in Japan and Japanese-controlled territories consistently pressured Japanese authorities to take action against Jews. The most dramatic example came in 1942, when Nazi representatives in Shanghai demanded that Japanese authorities implement the final solution in Shanghai's Jewish ghetto, where approximately 20,000 Jewish refugees lived. Japanese officials refused. They relocated the Jews to a designated area and imposed restrictions on movement, but they did not implement mass killings, deportations to death camps, or other Holocaust measures. Various explanations have been proposed for this Japanese stance. Some historians credit Japanese racial ideology, which, while considering Japanese superior to other races, lacked Nazi obsession with Jewish extermination. Others point to pragmatic considerations. Jews in Japanese territories posed no threat and offered potential benefits. Japanese officials also may have recognized that overtly persecuting Jews would damage Japan's international reputation and relationship with the United States, where Jewish advocacy groups held some influence. Some scholars suggest that Japanese officials, educated in Confucian ethics emphasizing human dignity and proper treatment of guests, found Nazi racial policies fundamentally repugnant regardless of alliance considerations. The most intriguing explanation involves the Fugu Plan, a proposal circulated in Japanese military circles in the late 1930s to settle thousands of Jewish refugees in Manchuria, using their skills and connections to develop the territory economically while securing American Jewish support for Japanese policies. The plan was named after the poisonous fugu fish, suggesting Jews were dangerous but potentially useful if handled carefully. The Fugu Plan was never fully implemented, but it reflected Japanese pragmatism regarding Jews and recognition that Jews were neither the threat nor the problem that Nazi ideology claimed. In this context, Sugihara's actions fit a broader pattern of Japanese officials declining to implement anti-Jewish policies despite German pressure. He was more courageous than most, actively defying orders rather than passively declining cooperation. But he was not acting in complete isolation from broader Japanese attitudes. His decision to issue visas, while personally courageous and officially insubordinate, aligned with an undercurrent of Japanese resistance to Nazi racial ideology. After Sugihara's death in 1986, recognition of his actions accelerated. The Japanese government, which had dismissed him in 1947 and ignored his actions for decades, posthumously restored his diplomatic status and officially acknowledged his service. In 2000, 60 years after the visas were issued, the Japanese Foreign Ministry established a plaza in his honor at their headquarters. Various monuments to Sugihara have been erected in Japan, Lithuania, Israel, and the United States. Museums dedicated to his story operate in his hometown of Yaotsu and in Kaunas, where the original consulate building has been restored as a memorial. Educational programs focusing on Sugihara's story have proliferated in Japan, where his example is used to teach moral courage and ethical decision-making. Japanese students study his actions as a counterexample to the militarism and obedience to authority that characterized Japan during World War II. The curriculum emphasizes that Sugihara demonstrated true patriotism not by blindly following orders, but by upholding values that transcend national boundaries: human dignity, compassion, and moral courage. The story has entered popular culture through books, films, and documentaries. Yukiko Sugihara, who survived her husband by 13 years, cooperated with numerous projects documenting his actions, providing family photographs, letters, and personal recollections.